Well, hello there everyone! Super Mario Land 2 6 Golden Coins is one of the weirdest 2D Mario games I've played, and in fact, it might be the weirdest one prior to Wonder, which, does its whole Wonder Flower thing. But it's also one of the more memorable ones. It's very different from the other games, with the levels being pretty much, you can tackle them in any order you want, barring the very first level and the very last level of the game. There's also very different worlds in terms of design compared to other games in the series. Instead of grass, desert, ice, water, that sort of worlds, here you have things like spooky haunted world, giant world but inside a house, large mechanic Mario as a factory world, and the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism, just to name some of them. It actually does a decent bit of experimenting in the levels design, and it's a pretty good way to kill an afternoon if you're bored. But how did the bosses in the game stack up? Well, about as well as you'd expect, but I'm doing a boss ranking anyways, so let's get on with it. Number 8, the Sewer Rat. A lot of this game's bosses boil down to jump on the enemy's head, so as a boss that has his head unable to be jumped on 80% of the time, he kinda sucks. The arena is surprisingly cramped, and this boss also moves very fast, while being able to turn corners on a dime, including halfway through the room, and you can only actually jump on the rat if he's ever flat on the ground, which is not for a very long period of time, meaning he's a hitbox for a majority of the fight, and he can turn corners very quickly. It's not necessarily a hard fight per se, but it's not a fun one at all. It's by far the lowest point of the game, and I guess it kind of fits considering it's the end of my least favorite world in the game. Because I guess when this game was breaking norms, it also decided the giant world had to suck. Number 7, Big Bird. I really hope this boss is intended to be the very first one you take on, because that's the only way I could see this design making any sense. All this boss will do is fly from one end of the arena to the other. In theory, you're supposed to jump on him during the flyby, which would be a timing game, but you could just wait at the opposite end of the arena and jump up and land on his head every time he's swooping down, making this boss a complete cakewalk and by far the easiest in the entire game. While I do appreciate the open nature of this game, I kinda think this guy should have been set as the tutorial boss instead. Number 6, Tatanga. The final boss of Mario Land 1 returns, and his boss fight is basically the exact same as Big Bird's. The big difference here is him firing out projectiles in interim periods, but he suffers from another fatal flaw since this fight takes place in space and you have infinite jump, and you always get a fire flower right before the battle begins, which means the optimal strategy is to just crouch in the corner, then fly up and spam him with fireballs until he dies. He gets above Big Bird simply because he has more attacks, and because I think Spaceland is overall a cooler world, even if it is a fairly short one with only like 2 levels technically. Number 5, Wario Orbs. In the final dungeon, really just a level, we have the game's one and only mini-boss, the Wario Orbs, bounce around the screen like old DVD logos, each taking 2 hits to bring down, and you're gonna go from fighting 1 to then fighting 2 of them to finally fighting 2 of them with desync movement. It's a simple idea, but not a terrible design for a mini-boss in a Game Boy game, and their immunity to fire keeps them from being cheesed out completely. It's not a bad way to cap off the final level of the game with a slightly more challenging foe than what you'd see otherwise. Number 4, Octopus. An underwater boss fight, huh? Well, it's okay. Like the other bosses, it's a jump on the boss's head scenario, but in this case you need to line up your jumps a bit better and wait for him to get close to the top of the water to land a good hit. This was actually the first boss I tackled in my playthrough, and overall he's fine. They have an underwater boss that isn't frustrating, and that's pretty commendable on its own, so I won't complain or ask for more. Plus, he does shoot out little octopi which act as projectiles for you to avoid. Or not avoid and just face tank the damage, because this is Mario Land 2 where you get like 3 hits and the enemies get 3 hits. Number 3, the Witch. Bootleg Baba Yaga over here is actually one of the game's harder bosses, as it's yet again a jump on the head 3 times opponent, but she's got more interesting attacks with her teleporting around the arena and firing out fireballs that can hurt you, but more importantly, if they don't hit you and instead they hit the cauldron, they will cause the underside of it to catch fire and shoot the lids upwards into spikes, which can be a risk-reward way to get some height and hit her if you're not confident in your jumps. And there's also a much tighter damage window on her compared to other bosses, so it requires a bit more precision. Overall, I'd say it's not a bad boss fight. Number 2, the 3 Little Pig Heads. At the end of my favorite level in the game, we have yet another boss where you jump on his head 3 times. But wait! Because unlike the other bosses, the pig heads take 3 hits each, giving them a total of 9 HP, only matched by the final boss. You fight them in the order of straw, twigs, bricks, just like in the fairy tale. The straw pig will roll around back and forth and get faster as his health gets lower, a trend shared among all the pig heads. Twigs will bounce around covering large distances but staying low to the ground, and he will increase his speed as well as the distance he bounces with each bit of damage he takes. And last but not least is Bricks, who will also leap but instead focus on vertical traversal, being able to jump heights much higher than even Mario himself, requiring timing to be on point. Overall, it's the second most involved boss in the game, and it's therefore the second best in my opinion. Plus, it helps that it comes at the end of my personal favorite world. The Mario Factory world is kind of awesome, not gonna lie. Number 1, Wario. Of course, number 1 had to go to the big bad boss man himself, Wario. He has 3 distinct phases and multiple attacks on top of a boss theme that progresses as the phases continue. Phase 1, he'll simply run back and forth, and then stomp the ground to drop a jar on top of you, but it's mostly harmless. In Phase 2, he'll show his ingenuity by using the Wing Cap power-up, and he'll now fly through the air, then butt slam, which not only hurts you if it hits, but it will stun you if you're on the ground. So, you actually need to wait for him to stop, and then try and line up your attack while he's slamming. And then, in the last phase, he reverts back to his Phase 1 moveset without the jars, but now, he's got a Fire Flower, so he can unleash fireballs against you. It's pretty cool having a boss that will use your own power-ups against you, and this was a gimmick that wouldn't really return until Mario 3D Land and 3D World, with the likes of Bowser with his Tanuki power-up, and then, more notably, Meowser, who used the Cat Bell and the Double Cherries. Overall, I think it's a pretty cool boss fight, and it introduced us a great character in the form of Wario, even if this was his introduction as just kind of a one-off villain. I'm glad he didn't stay one-off. And that's Mario Land 2 6 Golden Coins. A weird game to be sure, but it brought us the introduction of Wario, which would spawn a sequel about him, before turning into its own massive spin-off series with the likes of WarioWare and Wario Land, all those other sorts of games, with its own cast of characters, and pretty much the most voice acting out of any of the Mario adjacent series. It's a weird game that was pretty creative in its levels and set the stage for future, levels in the series, as well as other video game series. Without this game, we wouldn't have the likes of Wario Land 4, Pizza Tower, or Anton Blast. While Mario Land 1 played it safe in most aspects, Mario Land 2 is a game that is actually pretty novel and worth checking out at least once. I can think of worse ways to spend an afternoon. Anyways, that's all from me, everybody. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content of varying quality, consider liking and subscribing. And I will see you all next time with whatever boss ranking comes next. Until then, take care.